"Teacher, which is the most important commandment in the law of Moses?" To that, Jesus replied, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment." And at this, the guy's kind of like, okay, I understand that, because Jesus was actually quoting the book of Leviticus here. He was quoting Old Testament scripture, saying this is the first and greatest commandment that the Jews have, is to love the Lord their God with all their heart, all their mind, and all their soul. So the guy's kind of like, okay, that is the greatest commandment. But then Jesus adds something to it. He says, a second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. And at this, jaws probably drops, because people are like, well, we know we're supposed to love God, but we're supposed to love other people too. Like, we're supposed to love our neighbor as ourselves. And the guy was actually so surprised by this that if you go to read on in the story, he asks, well, who is my neighbor? He wanted to justify his actions and the fact that he didn't love people. And right here, Jesus is basically telling us the first and greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. See, we understand that if you don't love God with all your heart, and all your mind, and all your soul, and all your strength, then you can't call yourself a Christian. But Jesus is raising the standard here. And he's saying if you don't love your neighbor as yourself, then you are not fulfilling the commandments that God has given us. And so this entire message is going to be about loving your neighbor enough to fulfill the Great Commission in their life. Let me give you a general rule. This is the whole premise of this message right here. And it's the next thing on your outline. It says, if you truly know Jesus, then you tell those you love about him. If you truly know Jesus, you tell those that you love about him. And if you don't tell those that you love about Jesus, one of two things is true for you. Either one, you don't truly know Jesus. You might think you know Jesus, but you haven't met Jesus the way that Zacchaeus met Jesus, or the way that Matthew met Jesus, or the way that all the people in the Bible met Jesus, because we see a pattern that all the people who truly met Jesus, even after he was dead, they met Jesus, and they went and told everyone that they loved about Jesus. So either you don't truly know Jesus, or you don't love those people enough. And I'm not really afraid to say that. It doesn't really concern me if that offends you, because I had to be confronted with that truth myself. Last year in the 10th grade, I made this list of about 30 people that I needed to reach out to. 30 people that I needed to fulfill the Great Commission in their life. I needed to invite them to church. I needed to cultivate them. I needed to do all this stuff in their lives. And I made this list, and I say by the end of April, because I made this list at the beginning of April, so I say by the end of April, I want to have all these people at least come to my church one time. And my goal was that they'd come one time, but really I wanted them to stay and become disciples, and that was my genuine intention. And so I go to school for the month of April, and the month of April goes by, and then the month of May goes by, and at the end of May, it hits me that I haven't invited a single one of these people to church. Actually, I invited one person to church, and they said, we'll see, and they never came because that was their excuse. And so I didn't invite any of them to church. And so I'm praying at the end of May, and I'm like, God, why couldn't I do this? And God just said, maybe you don't love those people enough. And I thought, you know what, God? You're right. Duh. Maybe I don't love those people enough. Because if I loved them enough, then I would make sure that I remembered and that I would make the sacrifice to tell them about Jesus and invite them to church. So the whole message is about loving your neighbor enough to tell them about Jesus and share the gospel with them. Because if we love them and we truly know Jesus, then we tell them about Jesus. So before we get into that, I want to give you 3 warnings really, really, really quick about sharing the gospel. Because we all know those people who can share the gospel and actually turn people away from the gospel because they possess traits that just naturally turn people away from Jesus. In the book of Ephesians, in chapter 4, verses 1 through 2, Paul is talking, and he says, as a prisoner for the Lord, then, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. We all know the calling we have received is the Great Commission. So he's saying, live a life worthy of the Great Commission, be completely humble and gentle, be patient, bearing with one another in, what's that next word? Love. Bearing with one another in love. And so Paul gives 3 warnings here, and he says there are 3 traits that you have to possess if you want to successfully share the gospel. You've got to be gentle, you've got to be patient, and you've got to be humble. So we're going to go through those things, and I'm going to give you the opposite of those things, and these are the traits that you cannot possess in sharing the gospel. Number 1 is pride. You cannot possess pride in sharing the gospel. Pride is the opposite of humbleness. Pride says this. Pride says, I was an alright person. Okay, before I met Jesus, I was an alright person. I didn't really do anything bad. I mean, I was a good person. I think I would have gotten to heaven without all this stuff. But I met Jesus, and I was an alright person, and Jesus kind of just made me a better person. Like I was alright, but Jesus kind of made me better. Humbleness says this. Humbleness says I was dead. D-E-A-D. I was dead in my sin. Jesus saved me through his grace because I have faith in him and my good works back up that faith. Pride is the opposite of humbleness. Pride makes it all about me. If I'm saving someone with pride, and I'm inviting them to church with pride, and I'm telling them about Jesus with pride, I'm doing it for my benefit. I'm saying, I would love to see this person become a Christian because I know that God is going to look at me and he's going to smile at me and he's going to say, James, you're such a great steward, you're such a great servant. James, it's all about James. That's what pride says. But when we share the gospel with humbleness, we end up loving that person and we say, you know what, I'm going to cherish your soul, I'm going to cherish you, and I'm going to love you even through your faults. That's what humbleness does. And we all know that if we have pride in sharing the gospel, I already told you in the last message about causing people to just live where they please you, where their Christian walk is all about pleasing you and making sure they don't disappoint you. That's what happens when you share the gospel with pride, because you don't end up telling those people about your faults. So that's the first thing. The first trait that we cannot possess in sharing the gospel. The second one is this, pushiness. Pushiness is the opposite of gentleness. Pushiness is a hard topic because there are some people who you need to be pushy with. There are some people who need to be sternly told what they need to do, and there are some people that you need to just tell straight up and not candy-coat it and not be very gentle with them. But on the other hand, there are other people who you can't really do anything with them because they're going to be so offended if you tell them one thing. You've got to be completely gentle with those people. But it boils down to if you love them or not. See, if you love them, then you're willing to have a relationship with them. And if you have a relationship with them, that's when you learn how pushy or how gentle you need to be with that person. And if you genuinely love them, it just comes naturally. See, gentleness implies a relationship, and pushiness just implies force. If you plant a seed in the ground and you look at it and you yell at it for the next 20 years, your yelling at it is not going to help it grow. In fact, you're probably going to forget to cultivate it because you're busy telling it what to do and being pushy with the seed the entire time, and it's probably not going to grow. You have to be gentle with the seed and you have to cultivate it gently, and when it starts to grow, you have to be gentle so you don't rip it up, and you have to be gentle with seeds that grow. And so we cannot possess pride, we cannot possess pushiness, and the third thing that we cannot possess is impatience. And I hope that you know that impatience is the opposite of patience. This is the part where you fill in the blank for me. Impatience is the opposite of patience. When you plant a seed in the ground, go back to the seed analogy. It's a huge analogy. You plant a seed in the ground. You can't just look at it and expect it to grow instantly. Spiritual growth is a process, just like growing like a plant, because God created plants. I don't know if you realize that. God created seeds, and he created them as a reflection of how we grow. God created them so that we can look at them and say, that is how people grow. And so we see a seed grow, and it takes a while to grow, and we have to be patient with it, and we can't force it. And we just have to be patient with that seed and watch it grow. But patience comes with love. I have a friend who I've been trying to invite to church. I've been trying to fill the Great Commission in her life for about 4 years now. And I say that like it's no time at all, but think about where you were 4 years ago. That's how long I've been trying to fulfill the Great Commission in this girl's life. And there have been many times where I've told her about Jesus and I've told her about the Bible and I've said, you need to come to church. And she has downright rejected the gospel 5 or 6 times. And there's been times where she told me, James, you can't expect me to believe this. You can't expect me to believe the Bible. It just seems so false. It seems like one big fantasy. You can't expect me to believe this. You're being forceful. You're being pushy. And there's been a time when her boyfriend got involved and he was like, well, I'm a Christian too, so F off. And I was like, okay, what? And so it's been really, really hectic. And there's been some crazy situations in trying to share the gospel with this girl. But I can say safely that I still have a relationship with this girl, and me and her are still friends, and we still talk on a regular basis, and we are friends. She would consider me her friend, and I would consider her my friend, despite the fact that she has clearly rejected the gospel so many times. Why? Because I'm patient with her. I don't tell her about Jesus every chance that I get. I make sure that the time is right. There's a lot of praying and a lot of meditating that goes into it, and making sure that the time is right, and that's what comes with patience. But patience is not the only thing that comes with love. You see, if you love them, then you're going to be humble with them, you're going to be patient with them, and you're going to be gentle with them. It all comes through love. This whole message is about loving your neighbor enough to tell them about Jesus. And so all three of these characteristics require love for your neighbor, and you're never going to be able to possess these things unless you love your neighbor. And so actually, this is not going to be real quick. This is the whole meat of this message. We're going to take a look at 3 ways that Jesus showed love to his neighbors. Because the Bible says in 1 John that Jesus is love. Jesus is the bottom line. He is love. And so when you talk about love, you're talking about everything that Jesus did. Because Jesus is love. The first way that Jesus showed love to his neighbors is this. He hung out with sinners. He hung out with sinners, and that's number one. Jesus hung out with sinners. I'm going to tell you the story of Matthew. Many of us know that Matthew was a disciple of Jesus, and ironically, he wrote the book of Matthew. And so Matthew was a disciple of Jesus, but before Matthew was a disciple, he was a tax collector. Many people don't know that, but it says in the Bible that Matthew was sitting in a tax collector's booth when Jesus called him, and we all remember prostitutes, Matthew, tax collectors, down there. And so Matthew was sitting in a tax collector's booth, and Jesus was walking by, and he says, "Hey Matthew, why don't you just follow me?" Matthew's sitting there like shuffling through papers and like suiting his tie, like follow, like you, like right now, like can I, where are we, okay. And so Matthew just goes and he hangs out with Jesus all day long, and he truly met Jesus that day. And so what does Matthew do? Later, Matthew invited Jesus and all his disciples to his home as dinner guests, along with many tax collectors and other disreputable sinners. Matthew wanted to tell everybody else he knew about Jesus, and so he threw a party. And he threw this party and he invited many tax collectors and other disreputable sinners. And if you can imagine a party with a lot of disreputable sinners there, like think of the disreputable sinners that you know, this is a party with all those people there. You can imagine what this party is going to be like. There was probably alcohol at this party, and I don't know if they smoked weed back then, but there's probably weed up at this party. And so Jesus is in here, and he's hanging out with these sinners. And it says when the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with such scum?" In other words, why does he go to these parties? When Jesus heard this, he said, "Healthy people don't need a doctor. Sick people do." And that's Matthew 9, Matthew chapter 9, verse 10 through 12. Jesus said, healthy people don't need a doctor. Sick people do. Jesus spent 3.5 years of his life reaching out to sick people. He didn't reach out to the healthy people. He didn't reach out to the people in authority. He didn't reach out to the kings. He didn't reach out to the Pharisees. Jesus reached out to the people who had never been reached out to before. He reached out to those who had never received love before. He reached out to those who had never been cared for before. He reached out to the people who have never heard of the fact that there is a Savior who can wash away their sins and make them become alive. Why? Why did he reach out to those people? Because those people are the most likely people to respond to the gospel. The people who have never experienced love are going to say, wait, Jesus isn't that guy who always tells people what to do. Jesus loves me. Jesus wants to forgive my sins. Jesus wants to be my friend. That blows people's minds. When people receive Jesus, who have never heard of the fact that Jesus can love them, and they receive the love of Jesus, it's an amazing thing. And that's when people's lives get changed. So what's the practical point that we can learn from this? Here it is. Sit next to people you know of, but do not know. And at every point in this next section, there's going to be a practical point, and it's something that you can literally do when you go back to school. And this point is sit next to people you know of, but do not know. And we all know those people that we know of. Like we know their lifestyle, we know the friends, and we know the parties that they go to, we know the people they hang out with. We know people, but we don't really know people. Here's what I'm going to do on the first day of school. I'm going to walk into a class, and I'm going to look around the room, and first I'm going to find a strong man or woman of God. And I'm going to go up to them, and I'm going to say, hey, this class, there's going to be a lot of people that we don't know who need Jesus. So would you endeavor with me on this? Go on this endeavor with me and sit next to people that we don't know of and hold me accountable to doing this, and I'll hold you accountable to doing this. And would you build relationships with these people and invite them to church and continue to cultivate them and love them and fulfill the Great Commission in their life in this class with me? And the person either going to say no, or they're going to say yes, but it doesn't matter because I'm going to do it either way. I'm going to sit next to people that I don't know. I'm going to walk into class and I'm going to look around and I'm going to say, who is the least likeliest person for me to sit next to? And I'm going to say, there they are, and then I'm going to go sit next to them. And I'm going to build a relationship with them, and I'm going to reach out to them, and I'm going to love them. And I encourage you guys to all do the same thing too. And that's only going to come with accountability, which we'll get into at the end of this message. But we're called to reach out to sinners, and that is the first way that Jesus showed love to his neighbor. The second way is this: he crossed the boundaries. He crossed the boundaries. Now, we're not going to camp out on this point for long, because it kind of goes along with the last name. But basically, in Jewish society, you had Jews and then you had Gentiles. And then right in the middle, you had Samaritans. And there was a fine boundary, there was a cultural boundary between Jews and Gentiles and Jews and Samaritans. Jews were like a little sect, like they were the chosen people of God. And Jews did not talk to Gentiles, and they did not talk to Samaritans. And so one day Jesus goes up to this well, and there's this Samaritan woman there. And to be a Samaritan, first of all, in society, let me tell you about Samaritans real quick, actually. There's a lot of history that goes into Samaritans. Basically, Samaritans were this. There were a bunch of Jews living in this one place, and then something happened in history, and a bunch of Jews fled south, and a bunch of Jews fled north. And the Jews who fled north got together with Mount Chicka-Wow-Wow with some Gentiles, which was unheard of in God's law. And they had kids, and those kids were half Jewish, and they were half Gentile, and they began to live in an area known as Samaria, and they became known as Samaritans. And so to call somebody a Samaritan was like calling them a half-breed. It was like calling them a mutt. It was an insult to be called a Samaritan. And so for you to be a woman, first of all, in society, was just, back then, was just no. And for you to be a Samaritan woman, you had a pretty messed up life. Like, your life was not going to go the way that you wanted to because you were a Samaritan woman. And this lady's life was not going the way that she wanted it to. And so Jesus comes as well one day, and he's sitting there, and he has an opportunity to talk to this girl. And so he asks her, hey, would you get me a bucket of water? And like, all the jaws around just dropped. And they're like, did Jesus just talk to the Samaritan? He really just talked to him, and they're like whispering around, and Jesus looking around like, yeah, I talked to her, what? And so Jesus continued to talk to this Samaritan lady, and he actually ended up changing her entire life with one conversation. And I heard a quote the other day. Let me tell you about the Samaritan woman first. The Samaritan married 5 times, and she was living with the 6th man that she wasn't married to, and Jesus proceeded to tell her all this because he knew it all. And so I heard a quote that said, the Samaritan woman at the well went from a whore to an evangelist with one conversation with Jesus. That's all it takes, is one conversation with Jesus. One person to reach out to those people and go against the culture and go against the grain. And guess what? This lady met Jesus, and you know what she did after she truly met Jesus? She went back to her hometown and told all the people that she knew about Jesus and about this guy who would change her life. If you truly love Jesus, you tell those you love about him. If you truly know Jesus. And so what's the practical point that we can learn from this? What can we learn from the fact that Jesus crossed the boundaries? Here it is. Break up your clique, step out of your Christian bubble. Break up your clique, step out of your Christian bubble. This is something that I suck at doing. Let me just say that up front. Last year, when I came into class, I was like, okay, I'm going to sit next to like 5 or 6 Christians that I know, and we're going to sit there and we're going to talk about how awesome Jesus is, and we're going to talk about how awesome church is, and we're going to talk about how awesome God is, and all these great Christian-y things. And maybe, just maybe, the people on the outside will hear us talking about Jesus, and they'll come to us and they'll say, hey, I hear you think Jesus is awesome. I would like to think Jesus is awesome too, so I'm going to invite myself to your church, and I'm going to become a Christian, and I'm going to do all these things that you're doing. And that was my little fantasy world that I lived in. But Jesus did not say, hey, stay here in Galatia and make disciples of everyone who comes to you. Jesus said, go and make disciples. And so if we're going to make disciples, we've got to break up our clique, the friends that we regularly hang out with, and we've got to step out of our little comfortable Christian bubble. But James, then I'm going to be uncomfortable. Point number 3, he was uncomfortable. The third way that Jesus loved his neighbor, he was uncomfortable. Sorry, if I could get like 2 volunteers, I totally forgot about this. If I could get 2 people like maybe in the sound booth, well, maybe not you, to go get a table out of that closet and like prepare to set it up on the side. I totally forgot about that, sorry. Jesus was uncomfortable. I don't have a verse for this scripture, or I don't have a verse or a story for this. It says Matthew chapter 1 through 28, and that's like the entire book of Matthew. And so literally what I did is I went into the book of Matthew, and I went on BibleGateway.com, which has like the Bible in like Swahili, like no one reads that. And so I go on Bible Gateway, and it's like I go to the book of Matthew, just because I chose Matthew, and I go through every chapter of Matthew, and I'm like, there's got to be a time in one of these chapters where Jesus didn't do something different. And so I go through this book, and in every single chapter, I found something, or I found a time or an instance where Jesus did something that was different. Jesus did something that made him uncomfortable. He did something that was anti-culture. He did something that nobody ever did in every book of Matthew. And I'm sure I can find that in Luke, Mark, and John. In the story of Jesus' life, he always did different things. So let me tell you a story. I go into world history class one day. I'm in honors world history because I'm a wussy and I'll take AP. And so the AP class is before me. And I go into AP, or honors world history, and the AP class has made this list. And it says, the most influential ... It's got like the most influential places, the most influential events, the most influential people. And so I look under most influential people, and I look at number one. And the number one most influential person in the history of the world, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus Christ was the most influential person in the history of the world. And so I began to think, you know what? It doesn't matter if you look at it from a spiritual or a historical perspective. Jesus Christ changed the face of the world. I mean, he changed everything forever. And there's no denying that a man named Jesus came to earth. And whether he performed miracles or not, whether you want to believe that, Jesus Christ made a difference. Why? Because he was different. And different people make a difference. Different people make a difference. If you want to make a difference, you've got to be different. And being different makes you uncomfortable. Always. That's what uncomfortable is. It's being different. It's when you're the only different person, it just makes you uncomfortable. Have you ever been in a situation in class where the teacher has asked a question, and she said, who thinks it's this answer? And like all the people in the class raised their hand but you, and they're all like, yeah, I think it's that answer, but you know. Like, you know what the answer is. Like, she's like, does the sentence go the airplane or the airplane? Who thinks it's the airplane? And all the people raise their hand, and you're like, what? Maybe that's just me. And then she says, who thinks it's the airplane? And I raise my hand, and everyone is like, God, so dumb. And then she's like, well, James, you're correct. It's the airplane. When I have my hand raised, and I'm the only one with my hand raised because I know for a fact, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that this is the correct answer, it doesn't matter how uncomfortable I am with the only one with my hand raised. It's right. And living for Jesus is right no matter how uncomfortable it is. So what's the practical point that we can learn from this? What can we learn from being uncomfortable? Anytime you see something that freaks you out, run to it. Run to it. Anytime you see that person sitting at the lunch table by themselves, run to them. And you feel that push in you that says, go talk to that person. Go be uncomfortable with that person. You go and talk to them. Run to being uncomfortable. Anytime you see that person who needs money, give them some money. Be a Christian to them. Anytime you see someone sitting by themselves who just had a bad day, just go talk to them. Be uncomfortable. Jesus put it this way. There was this huge crowd following Jesus, and he turned and said to the crowd, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must turn from your selfish ways, take up your cross daily, and follow me. Jesus raised the standard. He said, it's not enough for you to stand here and look at being comfortable and say, man, I want to be comfortable so bad, but I'm not going to do it for Jesus. Jesus said, you've got to turn from that, and you've got to want to be uncomfortable for my sake. I don't know if you've ever carried a cross before, but when you pick up a cross, you're going to drop it unless you embrace it. And unless you hold on to it with everything that you've got, that cross is going to fall. And so when Jesus said, take up your cross and carry it, Jesus is saying, embrace being uncomfortable. Embrace being freaked out. Embrace being weird. Embrace being different. Be uncomfortable for my sake. We're never going to reach out to people who have never been reached out to. We're never going to show love to a person who's never been loved. We're never going to show Jesus to a person who doesn't know Jesus. We're never going to give life to a lifeless person if we're so focused on being comfortable. Because if we're focused on being comfortable, we are never going to do anything different. We're going to go through our whole high school career being exactly the same. So why hasn't anybody ever done this? If changing our schools for Jesus is this simple, if all it takes is being uncomfortable and loving our neighbor enough to tell them and inviting them to church and cultivating them, why hasn't anybody ever done this? It boils down to this. Luke chapter 12, verse 34 says this, wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will